good evening to all. Welcome to this new nocturnal journey. Settle in comfortably. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders relax gently. Tonight, we travel to Los Angeles, into the universe of Lieutenant Columbo, that detective with the creased face and worn raincoat, who solves the most complex crimes with apparent simplicity, a story of immutable routine, silent corridors, and an almost perfect murder. Thank you for being here with us tonight. In this soft and reassuring darkness, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a little like to help us continue creating these stories that accompany you to sleep. And above all, leave us a comment to tell us what you thought of this story or suggest a detective you'd like to hear in our next tales. Now, breathe deeply, close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself be carried away by the words. The Los Angeles sun was setting in a gradient of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the windows of the Westwood luxury apartments. It was an elegant 12-story building with a marble entrance hall, a uniformed doorman, and residents who appreciated their privacy as much as their social status. The kind of place where neighbors greeted each other politely in the elevator, but never really knew the details of each other's lives. On the 6th floor, the apartment belonged to Dr. Victor Harrington, a renowned 58-year-old psychiatrist who had built his career and fortune treating the anxieties and neuroses of Hollywood's elite. Tall, thin, with silver gray hair carefully combed back and tortoiseshell-framed glasses that gave him an intellectual air, Dr. Harrington perfectly embodied the prosperous and respected professional. But that evening, in the immaculate corridor leading to his apartment, something unusual was about to happen. Something that would shatter the perfectly orchestrated routine that governed the life of this building and its inhabitants. Dr. Harrington had a routine, an immutable routine, predictable as a Swiss clock. Every day of the week without exception, he left his office on Wilshire Boulevard at exactly 5:30 p.m. He drove his black Mercedes to his building, arriving invariably at 6:15 p.m. He always parked in the same spot in the underground parking. Space number 47. He took the elevator to the 6th floor, exited to the left, walked exactly 23 steps to his door, inserted his key in the lock and entered his home. Once inside, his routine continued with the same military precision. He removed his jacket and hung it in the entrance closet. He washed his hands in the bathroom for exactly 1 minute. He prepared himself a martini with 3 olives, no more, no less. He sat in his leather armchair facing the window and read the newspaper for exactly 45 minutes before preparing his dinner. The neighbors knew this routine. The doorman knew it. Even the cleaning lady, who came twice a week, knew that Dr. Harrington should never be disturbed between 6:30 and 8 p.m. It was his sacred moment of decompression after a day spent listening to other people's problems. But this particular Tuesday evening, the routine was about to be disrupted in a tragic way. In apartment 608, just 2 doors down in the same corridor, lived Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, a 72-year-old widow who shared with Dr. Harrington an appreciation for routines and punctuality. A former mathematics teacher, she spent her days doing crosswords, reading detective novels, and discreetly observing the comings and goings in the corridor from her peephole. It wasn't unhealthy curiosity, she liked to think, but simply a natural interest in her environment. Mrs. Whitmore knew exactly when Dr. Harrington came home each evening. She knew he always took the left elevator, never the right one. She knew he always wore the same beige raincoat in spring, the same grey overcoat in winter. She knew that on Wednesdays, he always received a visit from a certain Ms. Diane Carson, an elegant woman in her 40s who generally stayed 2 hours. This Tuesday evening, Mrs. Whitmore was in her kitchen, preparing her usual chamomile tea, when she heard the elevator arrive at the 6th floor. She glanced at the wall clock. 6:15 p.m. Punctual as always. Dr. Harrington was coming home. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. 23 steps as usual. Then the jingling of his keys. Then the familiar clicking of his door closing. But 5 minutes later, she heard something unusual. Dr. Harrington's door was opening again, rapid footsteps in the corridor, then the sound of the elevator leaving again. Mrs. Whitmore frowned. This wasn't normal. Dr. Harrington never went out again once home. Never. It was contrary to his sacred routine. Driven by curiosity, she headed to a peephole and looked into the empty corridor. But something caught her attention. The door of apartment 604 was slightly ajar, which was also unusual. Dr. Harrington was meticulous about security. He always locked his door with 3 turns of the key. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. Should she go check? It wasn't her business after all, but that ajar door bothered her. It was like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. Finally, her curiosity won out. She opened her own door and cautiously advanced into the corridor. She approached apartment 604 and knocked lightly. Dr. Harrington, is everything all right? No answer. She gently pushed the door, which opened silently. Dr. Harrington. She entered the apartment. The entrance hall was impeccable as always. Dr. Harrington's jacket was hanging in the closet. His keys were placed on the console table. Everything seemed normal. Then she saw him. Dr. Victor Harrington was lying on the floor of his living room, motionless, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. A small blood stain marked his white shirt at chest level. Mrs. Ennis Whitmore brought a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. She slowly backed away, her heart pounding, then rushed to her apartment to call the police. 20 minutes later, apartment 604 was buzzing with activity. Uniformed police officers secured the crime scene. Technicians took photos and lifted fingerprints. The medical examiner examined the body, and in the midst of all this organized chaos stood Lieutenant Columbo. Columbo was exactly as Mrs. Whitmore had imagined him from the descriptions she had read in the newspapers. Short, stocky, with brown tousled hair that obviously hadn't seen a comb since morning. He wore a wrinkled raincoat that had probably been beige originally, but was now an indefinable color between brown and gray. His eyes, however, were sharp and attentive, observing every detail of the scene with an intensity that contrasted with his neglected appearance. He stood near the body, one hand in the pocket of his raincoat, the other thoughtfully scratching his forehead. "So, Doc," he said to the medical examiner in a slightly hoarse voice. "What do we have?" The medical examiner, a bald man in his 50s named Dr. Patterson, straightened up with a slight groan. Single stab wound to the heart. Death almost instantaneous. The weapon was removed, probably by the murderer. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, I'd say he died about an hour ago, maybe a little more. Columbo nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving the body. An hour so around 6:30, 7 p.m. approximately. Yes, and there's no sign of struggle. No, none. The clothes aren't torn. No bruising on the hands or arms. I'd say he was surprised. He wasn't expecting to be attacked. Columbo turned to Sergeant Wilson, a young blonde officer taking notes in the notepad. "Sergeant, what do we know about the victim?" Wilson consulted his notes. Dr. Victor Harrington, 58 years old, psychiatrist, office on Wilshire Boulevard, divorced for 5 years, no children, lived alone here for 3 years. According to the neighbors, he was a quiet man, very routine-oriented, no known problems. Routine-oriented, no known problems. Routine-oriented, you say? Very. Apparently he did everything at the same time each day. The lady at the end of the corridor, Mrs. Whitmore, she says you could set your watch by Dr. Harrington's comings and goings. Interesting, murmured Columbo. He walked around the apartment, his hands still in his pockets, his eyes scrutinizing every detail. The living room was impeccably tidy. Not a cushion out of place, not a magazine misplaced. On the coffee table was an empty glass that smelled of vermouth. Next to it, a neatly folded newspaper. He prepared his usual martini, observed Columbo. He started reading his newspaper. Everything was normal in his routine. He approached the window and looked outside. The view overlooked Wilshire Boulevard, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. So someone enters, stabs him and leaves. No apparent theft. The wallet is still in his pocket with $250 in it. His Rolex watch is still on his wrist. The valuables in the apartment haven't been touched. He turned back to Wilson. Who had access to this apartment? Wilson consulted his notes again. According to the building manager, Dr. Harrington was very careful with his keys. He didn't give them to anyone. The cleaning lady, Mrs. Sarah Rodriguez, had a copy. But she only comes on Mondays and Thursdays, and she was at home in Brooklyn today. We checked. The manager himself has a master key, but he was in his office all evening and the door was locked when the victim came home. Miss Whitmore says she heard Dr. Harrington lock his door as usual. 3 turns of the key. She recognizes the sound. Columbo frowned. So he comes home, locks his door, begins his usual routine, and someone kills him. But how did that someone enter? And how did they leave without a key? Maybe Dr. Harrington opened the door to someone he knew, suggested Wilson. Possible. But according to his routine, he never received visits at this hour. And Mrs. Curry, Whitmore, who seems to have an excellent memory for details, says she didn't see anyone other than Dr. Harrington enter by that elevator. Columbo scratched his head, tousling his already disheveled hair even more. There's something that doesn't fit here. Something that's wrong with the timing. He approached the entrance and examined the door closely. The 3 locks were intact, no sign of forced entry. Sergeant, I'd like to speak with Mrs. Whitmore and also the doorman and everyone who works in this building. Someone must have seen something. And thus Lieutenant Columbo's investigation began. An investigation that would reveal that even the most perfect routines can hide the darkest secrets. But who had killed Dr. Harrington? And above all, how? Dear listeners, you're no doubt wondering how a murder can occur in a locked apartment, without witnesses, without a trace. Stay with us because Columbo is about to unravel a mystery where every detail counts, where every second has its importance. The corridor of habit still hides many secrets. Don't forget to leave a like if you're already captivated by this enigma. And tell us in the comments which detective you'd like to hear in our next stories. The next morning, Columbo arrived at the Westwood Luxury Apartments at 9 a.m. precisely. He had spent the night thinking about the case, turning and returning the details in his mind until his wife told him gently but firmly to turn off the light and sleep. But even in the darkness, his brain continued to work, assembling and reassembling the pieces of the puzzle. The day doorman, a man in his 50s named Marcus Johnson, greeted Columbo in the sumptuous hall. Marcus had worked in this building for 10 years and knew all the residents by name. Lieutenant Columbo, said Marcus, shaking the detective's hand. It's terrible what happened to Dr. Harrington. Such a kind man, so punctual. Yes, everyone tells me he was very routine-oriented, said Columbo, pulling out his wrinkled notepad from his raincoat pocket. Tell me, Marcus, were you on duty last night? Yes, Lieutenant. My shift goes from 2 p.m. to 10 p.m. So you saw Dr. Harrington come home like every evening. 6:15 p.m. sharp. He nodded to me as usual. He wasn't very talkative, Dr. Harrington. Polite, but reserved. And after he went up, did you see anyone else take the elevator to the 6th floor? Marcus thought, frowning. No, no one. Well, wait. There was Mr. Ez. Shen from 60 Wheat, who came home around 6:30 p.m. with his groceries, and Mr. Bradley from 612 came down around 7 p.m. to walk his dog, but no one unusual. And you didn't see anyone come down from the 6th floor who didn't live there? No, Lieutenant. It's a very quiet building. The residents like their privacy. Columbo nodded thoughtfully, tapping his pen against his notepad. Marcus, are there other ways to exit the building than through the main hall? There's an emergency exit in the stairwell, but it triggers an alarm if you open it, and there's access to the underground parking, but you need an electronic badge to open the door. And this alarm, did it go off last night? No, Lieutenant. I would have heard it. Of course, Columbo scratched his head. Another thing, Marcus. Did Dr. Harrington often receive visitors? Not really. There was a lady who came to see him every Wednesday evening. Mrs. Carson, very elegant. They had dinner together, I believe. Miss Carson, you have her full name. Diane Carson. She lives in Beverly Hills. She always arrived around 7 p.m. and left around 9 p.m. But not yesterday, since it was Tuesday. Exactly. Columbo thanked Marcus and took the elevator to the 6th floor. He knocked on the door of apartment 608, where Mrs. Whitmore lived. The door opened almost immediately, as if Mrs. Whitmore was expecting him. She was a thin woman with white hair styled in a tight bun and intelligent grey eyes behind gold-framed glasses. "Lieutenant Columbo," she said, opening the door wide. "I was hoping you'd come. Come in, please. I've prepared coffee." Mrs. Whitmore's apartment was the exact opposite of Dr. Harrington's. Where his was minimalist and orderly, hers was warm and cluttered, filled with books, family photos, and souvenirs accumulated over a long life. They sat in the living room and Mrs. Whitmore poured coffee into delicate porcelain cups. "So, Mrs. Whitmore," began Columbo after taking a sip of coffee, "tell me exactly what happened last night from the beginning." Mrs. Whitmore sat up straight, obviously happy to have an attentive audience for her account. "I was in my kitchen preparing my tea. It was exactly 6:15 p.m. I know because I was looking at the clock. That's when Dr. Harrington always comes home. I heard the elevator arrive, then his footsteps in the corridor. 23 steps, Lieutenant. Always 23 steps from the elevator to his door. You count them?" Mrs. Whitmore looked slightly embarrassed. "I'm a former mathematics teacher, Lieutenant. Counting is second nature to me, and when you live alone, you notice these little things. Routines are reassuring. I understand perfectly. Continue. So 23 steps, then the jingling of his keys, then 3 distinct clicks when he locks his door. 3 locks. You understand? He was very security conscious. And then, I heard his door close. Everything was normal. I continued preparing my tea. But about 5 minutes later, I heard his door open again. Rapid footsteps in the corridor, then the elevator going down. Rapid footsteps, you say? Like someone who was in a hurry. Yes, exactly. It wasn't Dr. Harrington's measured step. It was different." Columbo leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Different? How? Could you be more precise?" Mrs. Whitmore closed her eyes, concentrating on the memory. Lighter, as if the person was smaller and faster, more nervous. Dr. Harrington always walked with a steady, confident step. These footsteps were furtive. Interesting, very interesting. Columbo scribbled some notes. "And you didn't look through your peephole to see who it was?" "No, not immediately. It was only after, when I noticed that his door had remained ajar, that my curiosity was piqued." "How long after?" "Oh, maybe 5 minutes. I finished preparing my tea. I went into the living room. And that's when I noticed through my window that there was light in the corridor. Dr. Harrington's door always casts a shadow when it's closed, but that shadow wasn't there. So, you went to check." "Yes, and that's when I found him." Mrs. Whitmore shuddered slightly at the memory. "I'll never forget that image, Lieutenant." Columbo nodded sympathetically. "I understand it's very difficult, but you did exactly the right thing by calling the police immediately." He got up and approached Mrs. Whitmore's living room window. It overlooked an interior courtyard with a fountain and some benches. "Mrs. Whitmore, during yesterday evening, did you see anyone unusual in the building? Someone who doesn't live here?" "No, no one. It was a very quiet evening. Tuesday night, you understand? People generally stay home." Columbo turned back to her. "One last question. These footsteps that you heard leaving Dr. Harrington's apartment, are you absolutely certain it wasn't him?" "Absolutely certain, Lieutenant. I've heard Dr. Harrington walk in that corridor for 3 years. I would recognize his step among 1,000. It wasn't him." After leaving Mrs. Arniatis Whitmore, Columbo spent the rest of the morning questioning the other residents of the 6th floor. Mrs. Chen, an elderly lady of Chinese origin, confirmed that she had returned from grocery shopping around 6:30 p.m. and hadn't noticed anything unusual. Mr. Bradley, a businessman in his 40s, said he had gone out to walk his Labrador around 7 p.m., but hadn't seen anyone in the corridor. At noon, Columbo went to Dr. Harrington's office on Wilshire Boulevard. It was an elegant office on the 3rd floor of a modern glass and steel building. The receptionist, a young blonde woman named Jennifer Mills, had red eyes from crying. "It's so horrible," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Dr. Harrington was a wonderful boss, always kind, always patient. How long have you worked for him? Asked Columbo. 2 years. He managed his practice with great professionalism. Everything was always perfectly organized. I don't doubt it. Tell me, Jennifer, did Dr. Harrington have any patients who might have been dissatisfied? Perhaps someone who might have made threats? Jennifer shook her head. No, nothing like that. Dr. Harrington was very appreciated by his patients. Of course, some were difficult. That's the nature of work in psychiatry. But no one violent or dangerous. And in his personal life? Problems? Conflicts? Not that I know of. He was very private concerning his personal life. The only person he sometimes mentioned was Miss Carson. They were close, I believe. Diane Carson. Yes, she often called him here at the office. Columbo noted that in his notepad. Jennifer, yesterday Dr. Harrington left at 5:30 p.m. as usual. Yes, exactly at 5:30 p.m. He was very punctual. He had a very strict routine. This routine, everyone knew it? Jennifer shrugged. I suppose so, he didn't hide it. He often said that structure and routine were essential for a balanced life. Columbo nodded thoughtfully. One last thing. Did anyone come here yesterday afternoon? An unusual visitor. It was a normal day. Dr. Harrington saw his regular patients, 4 in all. The last one left at 4:30 p.m. You have their names. Jennifer consulted the appointment book on her desk. Mrs. Patricia Walsh at 2 p.m. Mr. Patricia Walsh at 2 p.m. Mr. Tricia Walsh. Robert Chin at 3 p.m. Miss Sarah Brennan at 4 p.m. and Mr. Thomas Keller at 4:30 p.m. Columbo noted all the names. Thank you, Jennifer. You've been very helpful. Leaving the office, Columbo stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, watching the cars passing on Wilshire Boulevard. Something bothered him about this case. Something didn't fit with the chronology of events. Dr. Harrington always came home at 6:15 p.m. He locked his door with 3 turns of the key. He began his usual routine, and a few minutes later, he was dead, stabbed in his own living room. But how had the murderer entered? And above all, how had they left? The footsteps that Mrs. Whitmore had heard leaving the apartment were the key. Columbo was certain of it. Light, furtive, nervous footsteps, not those of Dr. Harrington. So someone else was in the apartment. Someone who had killed Dr. Harrington and who had left, leaving the door ajar. But this someone, who were they? How had they entered? And why had they killed a respected psychiatrist who, according to all testimonies, had no enemies? Columbo shook his head and lit one of the cheap cigars he always kept in his raincoat pocket. He had the intuition that the answer was in the routines, in the corridor of habits that Dr. Harrington followed so religiously. Someone knew his routines. Someone had studied them, perhaps for weeks or months, and that person had found a way to use them to commit an almost perfect murder. Almost, but not quite. Because there was always a flaw, always a detail that didn't fit. And Lieutenant Columbo was determined to find that detail, however small it might be. And you, dear listeners, are you beginning to see the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, or are you as perplexed as Dr. Harrington's neighbors? Stay with us because Columbo is about to meet Mrs. Recking, Diane Carson, and this conversation will reveal surprising aspects of the victim's private life. The mystery thickens, and each clue brings us closer to the truth. If you like solving puzzles with Columbo, don't forget to subscribe and tell us in the comments which clue seems most important to you so far. That same afternoon, Columbo went to Beverly Hills to meet Diane Carson. She lived in an elegant Mediterranean-style house, on a palm-lined street with an impeccably maintained lawn, and a white Mercedes parked in the driveway. Mrs. Carson herself opened the door. She was a woman in her 40s, tall and slim, with auburn hair styled in an elegant bun and green eyes that showed obvious signs of grief. She wore a simple but expensive black dress and pearls around her neck. "Lieutenant Columbo," she said in a slightly trembling voice. "I was expecting your visit. Come in, please." The living room where she led Columbo was tastefully decorated, filled with antiques and paintings that suggested both wealth and culture. She invited him to sit on a cream velvet sofa, while she took a seat across from him in a matching armchair. "I am deeply sorry for your loss, Miss Carson," began Columbo with sincerity. "I understand that you and Dr. Harrington were close." Diane's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, we'd been seeing each other for 2 years. It wasn't a conventional relationship. Victor was very private, very cautious. But we loved each other. You saw him regularly. Every Wednesday evening, it was our evening. I came to his apartment, we had dinner together. We talked. Victor needed structure, routine. Wednesday was our day." "Why Wednesday specifically?" Diane sketched a faint smile. It was the quietest day of his professional week. He saw fewer patients on Wednesday. He could relax, be himself. "You understand, Lieutenant, in his work, Victor always had to be the therapist, the listener. With me, he could simply be a man." "I understand." Columbo took out his notepad. "Miss Carson, forgive my question, but were you his only romantic relationship?" Diane hesitated for a moment. "As far as I know, yes. That Victor was discreet. He could have had other aspects of his life that I wasn't aware of." "And your husband, Mrs. Carson, where is he? He died 4 years ago." "Pancreatic cancer. That's how I met Victor. In fact, I had come to consult him to manage my grief." "Ah, I'm sorry." "That's life, Lieutenant." Diane wiped away a tear that was running down her cheek. "And now, I've lost Victor too. It's as if I'm cursed to love people." Columbo looked at her with sympathy. "Miss Carson, where were you last night between 6 and 8 p.m.? "I was here at home alone. I was reading a book and preparing my dinner. Tuesday wasn't our evening, so I generally stayed at home." "Can anyone confirm that?" "No, my cleaning lady leaves at 4 p.m., and I didn't receive any phone calls last night." Columbo nodded and noted that. "Had Dr. Harrington seemed worried to you lately, perhaps concerned about something or someone?" Diane thought, frowning slightly. "Now that you mention it, yes, the last time I saw him, last Wednesday, he seemed distracted. I asked him what was wrong, but he said it was just a difficult patient. He couldn't talk more about it because of confidentiality." "A difficult patient," he didn't give more details. "No, but he said something strange. He said, sometimes helping people understand their own demons can be dangerous, especially when they don't want to confront them." "Interesting," murmured Columbo. "Mrs. Carson, did you know Dr. Harrington's routines well?" "His daily habits? Well enough, I suppose. He talked to me about them. He was proud of his discipline, of his ability to maintain structure in his life. He said it was what allowed him to be a good therapist, having that personal stability. And other people knew his routines, probably. Victor didn't make it a secret. He often talked about the importance of routines in his professional articles. I believe he even wrote a book on the subject a few years ago." After leaving Mrs. Carson, Columbo returned to the police station, where Sergeant Wilson was waiting for him with news. "Lieutenant, I checked the alibis of the 4 last patients that Dr. Harrington saw yesterday. Miss Walsh was at a charity dinner in Santa Monica with 50 witnesses. Mr. Chen was at his restaurant in Chinatown, confirmed by his staff. Miss Brennan was at a parent's house in Pasadena, confirmed. And Mr. Keller." Wilson paused, consulting his notes. "Mr. Keller, Thomas Keller, 42 years old, single, works as a freelance graphic designer. He doesn't have a solid alibi for last night. He says he was at home working on a project, but no one can confirm it." "Tell me about Mr. Keller. How long had he been a patient of Dr. Harrington?" "About 6 months. According to the receptionist's notes, he saw Dr. Harrington every week, on Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. "Tuesday, always the same day, the same time?" "Exactly, Lieutenant. Like all of Dr. Harrington's patients, he organized his schedule with the precision of a clock." Columbo rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Sergeant, I'd like to speak to this Mr. Keller." "You have his address?" "Yes. He lives in West Hollywood. Do you want me to call him to arrange an appointment?" No. I like surprise visits. You learn much more that way." An hour later, Columbo was knocking on the door of a small apartment in a modest building in West Hollywood. The door opened to reveal a medium-height man with disheveled blonde hair, blue eyes behind metal-framed glasses, and several days' worth of beard. He wore faded jeans and a black t-shirt marked with paint stains. "Mr. Thomas Keller," asked Columbo. Yes. The man immediately seemed nervous. Who are you? Columbo took out his badge. Lieutenant Columbo, LAPD. I'm investigating the death of Dr. Victor Harrington. I'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a moment. The color left Keller's face. Victor is dead. When? How? Last night you didn't know. No, I don't watch the news. I usually work late at night. What time? Keller opened the door wider. Come in, please. I'm in shock. Keller's apartment was an organized chaos. Computers and screens covered a large desk near the window. Sketches and graphic designs were pinned on all the walls. Books and magazines were piled in every corner. I'm sorry for the mess, said Keller, quickly moving some papers from an armchair so Columbo could sit. I don't often have visitors. No problem, said Columbo, settling in. So, Mr. Gavido, Keller, you were a patient of Dr. Harrington? Yes, for 6 months. I have problems with social anxiety. Victor was helping me a lot. Keller sat across from Columbo, his hands trembling slightly. I can't believe he's dead. What happened? We're still investigating, but tell me, you saw him yesterday afternoon, didn't you? At 4:30 p.m.? Yes, it was my weekly session. Always Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. How did the session go? Keller shrugged. Normally, I suppose. We talked about my progress, my difficulties interacting with people. Victor was always understanding. And after the session, what did you do? I came back here. I had a project to finish for a client. I worked until late at night. Can anyone confirm that? Keller shook his head. I live alone and I work alone. That's partly why I was seeing Victor. My isolation had become a problem. Columbo nodded, observing Keller carefully. The man was obviously nervous. But was it the normal nervousness of someone being questioned by the police? Or was there something else? Mr. H. Keller, had Dr. Harrington seemed different to you lately? Worried, perhaps? Keller thought, not really. He was always professional. But now that I think about it, in my last session, he asked a lot of questions about my routines, about how I structured my days. Your routines? Yes, he wanted to know if I followed a regular schedule, if I had daily rituals. He said that for someone with social anxiety, having predictable routines could be very reassuring. And do you have them, routines? A few. I get up at the same time each day. I work according to a fairly fixed schedule. I do my shopping on Sunday. That kind of thing. Columbo got up and began to walk around the apartment, hands in his pockets, observing the various graphic projects on the walls. You're very talented, Mr. Keller. These designs are impressive. Thank you, it's my livelihood. Columbo stopped in front of a particular sketch. It was a detailed architectural plan of a building that looked strangely like the Westwood luxury apartments. That's interesting, said Columbo, pointing to the drawing. It looks like the building where Dr. Harrington lived. Keller stood up quickly, his face becoming pale. Oh, that's just a design exercise. I like drawing buildings. It helps me concentrate. I see. Columbo examined the plan more closely. It showed not only the exterior of the building, but also the interior layout of the 6th floor with the interior layout of the 6th floor with the apartments clearly marked, including apartment 604. Mr. Keller, how do you know the interior layout of this building? Have you ever visited Dr. Harrington's apartment? No, never. I just imagined how it might be inside. That's what graphic designers do. We visualize things. But Columbo saw the sweat beading on Keller's forehead. He saw the man's hands trembling harder, and he knew with the instinct of an experienced detective that there was more to this story. Mr. Keller, said Columbo softly, I think there's something you're not telling me. Something important. And I think you'd be much more comfortable if you told me now rather than later. Keller collapsed into his armchair, burying his face in his hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was his labored breathing. Then, slowly, he looked up at Columbo. I loved him, he murmured. I loved Victor, not like a patient loves their therapist. I was in love with him. And there you have it, dear listeners, a revelation that changes everything. A patient obsessed with his therapist, drawing plans of his building, knowing his routines. Is Thomas Keller the murderer, or are there still other secrets hidden in this corridor of habits? Stay with us because Columbo hasn't finished unraveling this complex case, and the truth will soon emerge in a surprising way. Tell us in the comments if you think Keller is guilty, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our detective stories. The silence that followed Thomas Keller's confession was heavy and charged with emotion. Columbo said nothing for a moment, letting the man gather his thoughts. He had learned over the years that after such an important revelation, it was often better to let the suspects speak for themselves. Finally, Keller continued, his voice broken by emotion. I know it's wrong. I know it's against all the rules. A patient shouldn't have these feelings for their therapist. But I couldn't help it. Victor was the first person in years to really listen to me, to really understand me. When did you realize your feelings had changed? Asked Columbo softly. About 3 months ago. I started looking forward to our sessions. I thought about him constantly. I started following him. Following him. Keller nodded shamefully. I know, it's horrible, but I couldn't help it. I just wanted to be near him, know how he lived. I discovered where he lived. I started observing his routines. I knew exactly when he came home each evening. That's how you were able to draw that plan of his building. Yes, I went there several times. I stood in the hall, pretending to wait for someone. I observed, I drew. It was my way of feeling connected to him. Columbo sat down again, his face showing compassion, despite the gravity of the revelations. Mr. Cambis, Keller, did Dr. Harrington know that you were following him? That you had these feelings for him? No. Well, I don't think so. I tried to be discreet. But last week, during our session, he started asking me strange questions about my routines, yes, but also about my fantasies, my obsessions. I got the impression that he knew something. And what did you do? I denied. I diverted the conversation, but I was afraid that he had discovered that he was going to reject me as a patient. And I couldn't bear that idea. These weekly sessions were all I had. Columbo leaned forward. Mr. Keller, last night after your session at 4:30 p.m., did you go to Dr. Harrington's apartment? Keller's eyes widened. No, I told you, I came straight home. I didn't kill Victor. How could I kill someone I loved? Love and violence are sometimes closer than we think, Mr. Keller, especially when that love isn't shared. But I didn't kill him. I swear on everything that's dear to me. Columbo studied Keller's face for a long moment. The man seemed sincere in his despair, but Columbo had seen enough talented liars during his career to know that appearances could be deceiving. Mr. Keller, I need you to come to the station with me to make an official statement, and we'll need to take your fingerprints and a DNA sample. Am I under arrest? No, not for now. But you are a person of interest in this investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully. Back at the police station, Columbo asked Sergeant Wilson to take care of Keller's statement while he returned to his office to think. He sat at his cluttered desk, lit one of his cheap cigars and began to organize his thoughts. He now had several elements. 1. Dr. Harrington was a man of strict routine. Everyone knew his habits. 2. He had been killed at home between 6:15 and 7 p.m. during his sacred decompression period. 3. The door was locked when he came home, but someone left a few minutes later. 4. Thomas Keller was obsessed with Dr. Harrington and knew his routines in detail. Diane Carson had a romantic relationship with the victim, but had no alibi for the time of the murder. But something still didn't fit. How had the murderer entered a locked apartment? And above all, how had they been able to commit the murder without Mrs. Whitmore hearing a struggle or a cry? The phone on his desk rang. It was the medical examiner, Dr. Patterson. Lieutenant, I have the results of the complete autopsy. I found something interesting. I'm listening, Doc. The knife penetrated the heart with remarkable precision. No hesitant blows, no defensive wounds, a single mortal blow delivered by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Someone with medical knowledge. Not necessarily, but someone who had planned this very carefully. And there's something else. I found traces of sedative in his blood, midazolam to be precise. A sedative. But no one mentioned that he was taking sedatives. Exactly. Which means someone administered it to him, probably in his martini. The dose wasn't strong enough to make him sleep completely, but enough to slow him down, to diminish his reflexes. Columbo sat up abruptly in his chair. So, the murderer drugged his martini before killing him. Which means the murderer had access to his apartment before he came home. The sedative was already in the glass. After hanging up, Columbo sat, thinking intensely. If the sedative was already in the glass, then the murderer must have had a key to the apartment, or a way to enter without forcing the lock. He called Wilson. "Sergeant, I need you to check something. Who had access to Dr. Harrington's apartment in the last few weeks? The cleaning lady, the manager, anyone?" "I'll take care of it, Lieutenant." An hour later, Wilson came back with information. "Lieutenant, I spoke to the manager. He says the only person to have had access to the apartment outside of Dr. Harrington himself was Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady. She came on Mondays and Thursdays, and she was at home in Brooklyn yesterday." "We checked." "Yes, but Lieutenant, I found something interesting. Mrs. Rodriguez says that 2 weeks ago, she lost her keyring for a few days. She found it in her bag, but she thinks someone could have taken it and put it back without her noticing." Columbo leapt up. "Someone stole her keys, had copies made, then put them back." Sergeant, who knew that Mrs. Rodriguez had keys, who could have had access to her bag? "She says she often leaves her bag in a closet while she cleans. Anyone in the building could have accessed it, or anyone who knew when she worked and where she left her things." Columbo thought. Thomas Keller knew Dr. Harrington's routines. Did he also know those of his cleaning lady? Had he observed the building long enough to know when and how he could steal the keys? But something still bothered him. If Keller was the murderer, why would he leave such obvious clues? The building plan in his apartment, his confession of his feelings for the victim, it seemed almost too easy. And then there was this persistent question of the footsteps. Mrs. Whitmore had heard light, furtive footsteps leaving the apartment. Keller was a medium-height man. Would his footsteps match this description? The phone rang again. This time, it was the concierge of the Westwood Luxury Apartments. "Lieutenant Columbo, this is Marcus Johnson. I just remembered something that might be important." "I'm listening, Marcus." "About 2 weeks ago, I saw someone leave the building through the service door." "That's unusual, because that door is normally reserved for deliverymen and maintenance staff. It was a woman, I think, but she wore a cap and sunglasses, so I couldn't see her face clearly." "What time was it?" "Mid-afternoon, around 2 p.m. Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady, was working that day. I remember because she had asked me to help her carry a new rug into Dr. Harrington's apartment." "And you think this woman could have been in the building while Mrs. Rodriguez was working?" "It's possible, Lieutenant. As I told you, the service door isn't monitored like the main entrance." After hanging up, Columbo turned to Wilson. "Sergeant, I need you to find everything you can about Diane Carson where she was 2 weeks ago. What are her habits? Does she know Mrs. Rodriguez? You think Mrs. Carson is involved?" "I think everyone is involved until proven otherwise. But yes, there's something about Mrs. Carson that bothers me." The next morning, Columbo returned to Beverly Hills. This time he didn't call ahead. He arrived at Diane Carson's house at 8 a.m., knowing he would probably catch her by surprise. He did. When she opened the door, she wore a silk bathrobe and her hair wasn't styled. She seemed surprised and slightly irritated to see him. "Lieutenant Columbo." "It's very early." "I apologize, Miss Carson. I just have a few follow-up questions. May I come in?" She hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. "I was about to have my breakfast. Would you like coffee?" "That would be kind, thank you." In the kitchen, while she prepared the coffee, Columbo observed carefully. He noticed her hands trembling slightly as she poured the coffee. He noticed the way she avoided his gaze. "Miss Carson, I discovered something interesting. It seems that someone had access to Dr. Harrington's apartment before the murder. Someone who had a copy of his keys." Diane almost dropped the cup she was holding. "Really? How is that possible?" "That's what I'm trying to understand. Tell me, where were you 2 weeks ago, a Thursday afternoon?" 2 weeks ago, I don't remember. Probably here at home. You went to the Westwood luxury apartments. Diane's eyes widened. No? Why would I have gone there on a Thursday? Wednesday was our day. Columbo took a sip of coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. Miss Carson, I think you're not telling me the whole truth. I think you knew things about Dr. Harrington that he didn't want you to know, and I think that made you angry. Very angry. Diane put down her cup with a clatter. I didn't kill Victor, if that's what you're insinuating. I'm not insinuating anything, ma'am. I'm just looking for the truth. Columbo got up and began to walk around the kitchen, hands in the pockets of his raincoat. You see, here's what I think happened. I think you discovered that Dr. Harrington was seeing someone else. Maybe not romantically, but someone who was taking an important place in his life. And that hurt you. Tears rose to Diane's eyes. You don't understand. Victor was everything to me. After my husband's death, he was my only reason to continue. And when you thought you might lose him, you took drastic measures. But before Diane could respond, Columbo's phone rang. It was Wilson. Lieutenant, I found something important. You need to come back to the station immediately. And there, dear listeners, we arrive at a crucial moment in the investigation. Columbo is about to discover the missing piece of the puzzle, the one that will tip the entire case. Who really killed Dr. Harrington? Is it Diane Carson, the jealous lover, Thomas Keller, the obsessed patient, or someone else we haven't yet considered? Stay with us for the resolution of this complex mystery, and don't forget to tell us in the comments who you think is the culprit before the final revelation. Subscribe so you don't miss any of our detective stories. Columbo hastily left Diane Carson's house and went to the police station where Wilson was waiting for him. With an expression of unusual excitement on his usually impassive face. Lieutenant, you're not going to believe what I found, said Wilson, handing Columbo a thick file. I did in-depth research on all of Dr. Harrington's patients, and I found something very interesting concerning one of them. Columbo opened the file and began to go through it. His eyes gradually widened as he read. Sarah Brennan, he murmured. The young woman who had an appointment with Dr. Harrington at 4 p.m. yesterday. Exactly. Apparently, Miss Brennan isn't just a simple patient. She's Thomas Keller's ex-girlfriend. Columbo looked up from the file. Keller didn't tell us that. No, he didn't, and there's more. According to her records, Miss Brennan started seeing Dr. Harrington 4 months ago, shortly after her breakup with Keller. She was consulting him for relationship problems and, hold on, to manage the harassment she was suffering from her ex-boyfriend. Keller was harassing her? According to these notes, yes. Constant phone calls, unexpected appearances at her home, obsessive messages. That corresponds to the profile of someone who transfers their obsession from one person to another. Columbo sank into his chair, thinking intensely. So Keller starts seeing Dr. Harrington for his social anxiety. Meanwhile, his ex-girlfriend consults the same therapist for the harassment she's suffering from him. Dr. Harrington probably discovers the connection and decides to confront Keller during their last session, completed Wilson. That's why he was asking all those questions about routines and obsessions. Dr. Harrington knew that Keller was obsessed. He probably knew that Keller was following him, observing his routines. He was trying to get him to admit his obsessive behavior. Columbo stood up abruptly. We need to speak to Sarah Brennan immediately. You have her address? Yes, she lives in Santa Monica. 30 minutes later, Columbo and Wilson were knocking on the door of a small apartment near the beach. Sarah Brennan was a young woman of about 28 years old, with short brown hair and hazel eyes that betrayed deep anxiety. When she saw Columbo's badge, her face paled. Miss Brennan, I'm Lieutenant Columbo. You may have heard about Dr. Harrington's death. Yes, she murmured, her voice barely audible. It's horrible. I can't believe he's gone. May I come in? I have a few questions to ask you. Sarah let them into a modest but comfortable living room. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands nervously twisting a tissue. Miss Brennan, you were Dr. Harrington's last patient yesterday. You saw him at 4 p.m. Yes, it was my weekly session. How did that session go? Sarah hesitated, looking at her hands, it was different. Dr. Harrington seemed worried. He asked me a lot of questions about Thomas. Thomas Keller, your ex-boyfriend? Yes, Dr. Harrington had discovered that Thomas was also his patient. He was very concerned about certain behaviors that Thomas was showing. What behavior? The obsession, the need to control, the stalking. Sarah looked up at Columbo, tears shining there. Lieutenant, I was afraid of Thomas. That's why I started seeing Dr. Harrington. After our breakup, Thomas couldn't let go. He called me 10 times a day. He appeared in front of my home, in front of my work. He said he loved me, that he couldn't live without me. And Dr. Harrington was trying to help you. Yes, he was wonderful. He gave me strategies to manage the situation, to protect myself, and he was also trying to help Thomas understand his behavior. But yesterday, Dr. Harrington seemed worried. Why? Sarah took a deep breath. He told me he thought Thomas had become obsessed with him in the same way he had been obsessed with me. He told me he had noticed Thomas observing his building, following his routines. He told me he was going to have to confront Thomas. Perhaps suggest he see another therapist. And what did you think of that? I was afraid. I knew how Thomas reacted when he felt rejected. He became irrational, sometimes violent. I warned Dr. Harrington to be careful. Columbo nodded, noting all of this in his notepad. Miss Brennan, after your session, where did you go? To my parents' house in Pasadena, as I told you when the police called me. My parents can confirm. I stayed there all evening and all night. Yes, we checked. Your alibi is solid. Columbo stood up to leave, then turned around as if he had just thought of something. Oh, one last thing, Miss Brennan. Did Thomas know Mrs. Rodriguez, Dr. Harrington's cleaning lady? Sarah seemed surprised by the question. Mrs. Rodriguez? I don't know why. Simple curiosity. Thank you for your time, Miss Brennan. In the car, returning to the station, Wilson turned to Columbo. Lieutenant, you really think it's Keller? All the clues point to him. Too many clues, Sergeant. That's what bothers me. When a suspect seems too guilty, when all the clues point in one direction, it's often that we're being led on. But he had the motive, the opportunity, and knowledge of the victim's routines. What more do we need? The truth, Sergeant. The truth never leaves inconsistencies, and there are still things that don't fit in this case. Back at the station, Columbo spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing all the elements of the case. He examined the crime scene photos, reread the testimonies, studied the building plan that Keller had drawn, and suddenly something caught his attention. On the plan drawn by Keller, there was a detail that didn't correspond with reality. Apartment 604 was represented with a slightly different configuration from the one he had seen in person. He called the building manager. Mr. Simons, this is Lieutenant Columbo. I have a question about apartment 604. Did Dr. Harrington have any renovation work done recently? Yes, Lieutenant. About a year ago, he had a wall knocked down between the living room and the guest bedroom to create a large workspace. Why? And who knew about these renovations? Well, all the building staff, of course, and probably the close neighbors because of the noise from the work, and Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady, since she worked there during the renovations. Mrs. Rodriguez, of course. Columbo hung up slowly, an expression of understanding forming on his face. He called Wilson. Sergeant, I need you to find Mrs. Rodriguez's address and also call Diane Carson. Tell her I need to see her at my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. It's important. You've understood something, Lieutenant? Yes, Sergeant. I think so. I think I know who killed Dr. Harrington and why and how. The next morning, Columbo organized a meeting in the police station's conference room. Diane Carson arrived at 9 a.m. precisely, looking tense and worried. Thomas Keller was brought from the cell where he had spent the night after his formal arrest. Sarah Brennan, also summoned, sat as far as possible from Keller. And to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady, was also present. Thank you all for coming, began Columbo, standing in front of a whiteboard where he had pinned photos and notes. I know you're all wondering why I gathered you here. Well, it's simple. One of you killed Dr. Victor Harrington, and I think it's time the truth came out. A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Keller half rose from his chair. You said I was the main suspect. Sit down, Mr. Druin. Keller, said Columbo calmly. Yes, you were a suspect. You had a motive. You were obsessed with the victim. You knew his routines. You had even drawn a plan of his building. He took out the drawing and showed it to the assembly. But you see, this plan revealed something important to me. It shows Dr. Harrington's apartment before his renovations, not after. Which means that Mr. Corridorin, Keller was never inside the apartment. He just imagined the layout from the outside. Someone who had actually visited the apartment recently would have known that there was no longer a wall between the living room and the former office. He turned to Diane Carson. Mrs. Carson, you told me that you saw Dr. Harrington every Wednesday evening, that you had dinner together in his apartment. You should have known that the configuration had changed. But when I questioned you the first time, you never mentioned this open workspace. Why? Diane paled. I didn't remember the details. I was upset. Or maybe, said Columbo softly, because you were never in that apartment. Maybe your relationship with Dr. Harrington wasn't what you claimed. He turned to the others. You see, I checked. Dr. Harrington never received visitors at home on Wednesday evening or any other evening. He was a very private man. His routines didn't include romantic dinners. Mrs. Hayes. Carson invented this relationship to give herself a reason to be close to the victim, to explain why she knew his habits. But how did she know his habits if she didn't have a relationship with him? Asked Wilson. Columbo smiled slightly. Because someone else told them to her. Someone who was actually in Dr. Harrington's apartment regularly. Someone who had access to his keys, to his martini, to his entire private life. He turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. Isn't that right, Mrs. Rodriguez? The cleaning lady remained motionless, her face impassive. Mrs. Rodriguez worked for Dr. Harrington for 3 years. She knew all his routines. She knew when he came home, what he did, what he drank. She had the keys to his apartment, and she had a secret. Columbo took out a photo and showed it to the assembly. It was a photo of Mrs. Rodriguez with a young woman who looked strangely like Diane Carson. Mrs. Rodriguez has a daughter who looks a lot like Miss Carson. In fact, they could have been sisters, and this daughter 2 years ago was a patient of Dr. Harrington. He took out another document. Maria Rodriguez, 28 years old. She was consulting Dr. Harrington for severe depression and suicidal thoughts. But according to these medical records that I finally managed to obtain, Dr. Harrington stopped treating her a 1.5 years ago. He referred her to another therapist. Mrs. Rodriguez suddenly stood up, tears streaming down her face. He abandoned her. My daughter needed him, and he abandoned her. He said he could no longer treat her, that she needed someone else, but she trusted him. She felt safe with him. And what happened to Maria? Asked Columbo softly, although he already knew the answer. She killed herself 6 months ago. She took an overdose of medication, and it was his fault. If he had continued treating her, if he hadn't rejected her, she would still be alive. Diane Carson also stood up, tears on her face. Mrs. Rodriguez came to see me 3 months ago. She told me what had happened to Maria. I was devastated. Victor had told me he wasn't taking new patients anymore, that he was too busy. But he continued seeing Thomas, Sarah, all the others. Why not Maria? Because, said Columbo, Dr. Harrington had recognized that Maria was developing an unhealthy dependence on him, exactly as Thomas Keller did later. Dr. Harrington was trying to do what was ethically correct by referring her to another therapist. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't see it that way. He turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. You started planning his death. You knew exactly when he came home, what his routine was. You stole your own keys from your bag, and you gave them to Miss Carson, didn't you? Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Diane wanted to help. She wanted to understand why Victor had rejected Maria. We thought that if she could talk to Victor, reason with him. But that didn't work, continued Columbo. So, you decided to kill him. Last Tuesday, you went to his apartment while he was at work. You prepared his martini with sedative. You waited for him to come home, to drink. And when the sedative started to take effect, you came out of your hiding place and you stabbed him. Where was she hiding? Asked Wilson. In the entrance closet. She knew every inch of that apartment. She knew that Dr. Harrington would hang his jacket in that closet, but that he would never look inside. She stayed there, waiting for the right moment. Columbo turned to Diane. "And you, Miss Carson, you were the diversion. You invented this story of romantic relationship to make us believe you were close to Dr. Harrington, to explain how you knew his habits. You thought that if we suspected you, we wouldn't look toward Mrs. Rodriguez." Diane collapsed in a chair, sobbing. "I didn't want him to die. I just wanted to understand. But when Mrs. Rodriguez told me Maria's story, I was so angry. It reminded me of my own grief, my own loss." "But you didn't kill Dr. Harrington yourself," said Columbo. "It was Mrs. Rodriguez. The light footsteps that Mrs. Whitmore heard leaving the apartment, they were yours. Mrs. Rodriguez, you're a small woman. Your footsteps are much lighter than those of a man." Mrs. Rodriguez sat down slowly, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "He deserved to die. He killed my daughter as surely as if he had given her the poison himself." "No, Mrs. Rodriguez," said Columbo softly. "Dr. Harrington was trying to do what was right. But your daughter's depression was deeper than what one therapist could manage. It was no one's fault. It was a tragedy. But killing Dr. Harrington didn't bring Maria back. It just created another tragedy." And there you have it, dear listeners, how the mystery of the corridor of habits was solved, not by the obvious suspect, but by someone no one would have suspected, a grieving mother, consumed by sorrow and rage, who used her intimate knowledge of her victims' routines to commit an almost perfect murder. Almost, but not quite, because there was a detective who was never fooled by appearances, who always asked one more question, who always looked for that small inconsistency that revealed the truth. Stay with us for the final epilogue, and please, tell us in the comments what you thought of this story and which detective you'd like to hear next. Your support means everything to us. 2 weeks after the arrest of Mrs. Rodriguez and Diane Carson, Columbo stood once more in front of the Westwood luxury apartments. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the air carried that particular golden quality that characterizes Los Angeles in late autumn. He had come to pay a final visit to Mrs. Easy Whitmore to thank her for her help in the investigation. She welcomed him with her usual hospitality. The coffee already prepared. "Lieutenant Columbo," she said, pouring coffee into the porcelain cups. "I followed the case in the newspapers. What a tragic story. All those lives wasted by grief." "Yes, ma'am," nodded Columbo, accepting the cup. "It's always like that in these cases. There are never really any winners, just different degrees of loss." "Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to be such a kind woman," said Mrs. Whitmore. "I crossed paths with her several times in the corridor, always polite, always smiling. I would never have imagined." "No, no one ever imagines. That's what makes certain crimes so difficult to solve. Murderers don't always wear an obvious mask. Sometimes they look like anyone." Mrs. Whitmore poured milk into her coffee, stirring thoughtfully. "And that poor Mr. Keller, he was innocent finally, but his life is still ruined. His obsession was publicly exposed. Mr. Keller is now following therapy with another psychiatrist," said Columbo, a specialist in obsessive disorders. "There's hope for him. With the right treatment, he can learn to manage his tendencies." "And Miss Brennan, is she all right?" "She decided to move to another city for a new start. Sometimes that's what people need, a place where no one knows their story, where they can rebuild." They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their coffee. Through the window, Columbo could see the building corridor through Mrs. Whitmore's open door. That corridor where so many things had happened. That corridor of habits that had been the theater of a carefully orchestrated tragedy. "You know, Lieutenant," said Mrs. Whitmore finally, "this whole affair made me think about routines. Dr. Harrington was so attached to his routines, to his structure, and it's precisely this predictability that allowed someone to kill him. Sometimes, I wonder if we shouldn't all be a little more spontaneous, a little less routine-oriented." Columbo smiled slightly. "Maybe, but routines also give us a sense of stability, of control in a world that can be chaotic. The problem wasn't Dr. Harrington's routines. The problem was that someone used them for malicious purposes. That's true. It's always the people, isn't it? Not the habits, not the routines, but what people decide to do with the information they have. Exactly, ma'am, exactly. Columbo finished his coffee and stood up to leave. Mrs. Ashbury, Whitmore accompanied him to the door. "Lieutenant," she said before he left. "One last question, if you'll allow me. How did you know it was Mrs. Rodriguez? What put you on her trail?" Columbo stopped, thinking. It was an accumulation of small details. The light footsteps you heard, the fact that the murderer knew not only Dr. Harrington's routines, but also the exact interior of his apartment after the renovations, the sedative in the martini, which required prior access to the apartment, and above all the lack of apparent motive for the obvious suspects. "You mean Keller and Mrs. Carson?" Yes, Keller was obsessed, certainly, but he had no reason to kill the object of his obsession. Obsessive people want to be near the person, not lose them, and Mrs. Carson didn't even have a real connection with the victim. Her story didn't hold up from the start, but it served as a diversion, intentionally or not. "So, you looked for someone else?" "Yes, someone with access, a real motive, and the ability to commit the crime. Mrs. Rodriguez checked all the boxes, and when I discovered her daughter's story, everything became clear." Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "You're a remarkable man, Lieutenant. St. Mary Mead would have needed someone like you." "St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's village. Ah, I've read some of those books. She's brilliant, Miss Marple. But me, I'm just a simple cop who asks a lot of questions and who never lets go." "It's more than that, Lieutenant. It's much more than that." Going down to the building lobby, Columbo crossed paths with Marcus, the doorman, who greeted him warmly. "Lieutenant, good to see you again. I hope the case is closed now." "Yes, Marcus, everything is resolved." "That's a relief." The residents were worried. "But now I suppose everything will return to normal." "Yes, normal," repeated Columbo. "Everyone will resume their routines, their habits. The corridor will just be a corridor again. People will continue coming home at the same time, following the same paths. That's comforting, isn't it? The routine, the predictability." "Yes," said Columbo thoughtfully, "until it's not." He left the building into the golden afternoon light. His old Peugeot was parked along the curb, faithful and a bit dilapidated as always. He got inside, lit one of his cheap cigars and sat for a moment, thinking. This case had affected him more than usual, perhaps because there were no real villains. No calculating and heartless criminal, just a mother broken by grief who had made a terrible decision, and another woman, herself in mourning, who had let herself be drawn into a murderous plan by empathy for that pain. Dr. Harrington wasn't perfect either. He had done what he thought was right, by referring Maria Rodriguez to another therapist, but he perhaps hadn't fully understood how much she depended on him, or perhaps he had understood, and that was precisely why he had ended their therapeutic relationship. But the result had been the same. A vulnerable young woman had felt abandoned and had chosen to end her life. And now, 2 other lives were destroyed. Mrs. Rodriguez would probably spend the rest of her days in prison. Diane Carson, although less guilty, would face charges of being an accomplice. Her reputation was ruined. Her life transformed forever. Columbo sighed deeply. That was the dark side of his work. Solving the crime never brought back the victim, and punishing the guilty never made things as they were before. But it was still important to seek the truth, to ensure that justice was done, because without that, all that remained was chaos, lies, uncertainty. He started his car and began to drive, not toward the police station, but toward his home. His wife was waiting for him dinner, probably already on the table, and after dinner he would sit in his favorite armchair, take off his tired shoes, and watch a bowling match on television. His own routines, his own habits, the familiar corridor of his own life. And tomorrow there would be a new case, a new mystery, new suspects, new clues, new questions to ask, because that was what he did. That was what he was. Lieutenant Columbo in his wrinkled raincoat and his worn shoes, always asking one more question. never letting go until the truth was revealed. And somewhere, in the streets of Los Angeles that stretched before him in the declining light, there was already someone planning the perfect crime. Someone who thought they were too clever to be caught. Someone who didn't suspect that a small neglected detective would soon be knocking on their door with that familiar phrase, "Just one last thing." And there you have it, dear listeners, how our story of the Corridor of Habits ends. A story of broken routines, destructive grief, and a detective who never lets himself be fooled by appearances. Thank you for spending this night with us, for following Columbo in his patient and methodical investigation. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our detective stories. Leave a like if you enjoyed this story. It helps us enormously to continue creating this content for you. And above all, leave us a comment. Tell us what you thought of this story. Did you guess who the murderer was? Which detective would you like to hear in our next story? Sherlock Holmes, Miss Marple, Hercule Poirot, or another detective you love? Your suggestions inspire us and help us create the stories you want to hear. Now, close your eyes. Let your breathing slow down. Feel your body become heavy and relaxed. Imagine yourself walking in a peaceful corridor, your steps regular and comfortable, following a familiar routine that brings you security and peace. Let this image gently accompany you towards sleep. Good night, dear listeners. Sleep deeply, have beautiful dreams. And remember that even in the darkest moments, there's always someone seeking the truth. Always someone who never gives up. See you soon for a new nocturnal adventure. Good night.